Dakota People Mankato 1862. Defiance amid exile and loss. A history documentary. I'm here, shouted the 38 Dakota men as they faced death on a Mankato scaffold, the largest mass execution in U.S. history, approved by Abraham Lincoln himself. Their voices refused to be silenced. Want to hear their story? Subscribe to Native Legends and History Stories now. What pushed them to this fateful stand? The Dakota people's story begins long before that fateful day in Minnesota, according to their oral traditions. Passed down through generations, their ancestors emerged from the earth itself. Mother Earth gave birth to the first grandmother and grandfather at a place they called Minnesota, the heart of the upper Mississippi River. This wasn't just a location, it was sacred ground, where the river's waters flowed through. Their earliest memories from these first ancestors came for eastern Dakota tribes, each with its own identity. The B'dua-Kantanwan, known as the people of Mystic Lake, settled near the shimmering waters of what's now southern Minnesota. The Wapakut, the hunters in the leaves, roamed the forests skilled at tracking game. Further west, the Sissetonwan, or the Fish Camp people, built their lives around lakes teeming with fish, and alongside them lived the Wahpetonwan, the dwellers in the leaves, who thrived in the wooded lands. These weren't just names, they were ways of life, tied to the land that sustained them. For centuries the Dakota lived there, their days marked by hunting, fishing, and seasonal moves across the plains and forests. Then in the early 1600s, everything changed. French fur traders arrived, men in strange clothes, speaking a strange tongue, carrying metal tools and weapons. The Dakota were the first of their people to meet these outsiders. At first it was cautious curiosity. A Dakota hunter might have handed over a beaver pelt, watching as a trader weighed it and offered a knife in return. "This blade cuts better than stone," the trader might have said, demonstrating its edge. The Dakota weren't naive. They saw value in the exchange. Over the next 100 years, from the 1600s to the 1800s, their lives tangled with these newcomers. In complex ways they fought. When raiding parties threatened their villages, the clash of arrows against muskets, ringing through the trees, they traded when it suited them, swapping furs for guns, cloth, and kettles. Some even married into white families, their children growing up with one foot in each world. But this wasn't a simple story of coexistence. The Dakota adapted, yes. They learned to use firearms, or wool blankets alongside buckskin. Even took up some Christian prayers. Yet they never fully abandoned their own ways. Elders still taught the old songs, and warriors still honored the spirits of the land. For a time it worked. By the mid-1700s, French and later British traders relied on Dakota knowledge to navigate the rivers and forests. A British officer once scribbled in his journal, "Without these Sioux we'd be lost in this wilderness." The Dakota held their ground, balancing tradition with the pressures of a changing world. Then came the Americans. After the United States won its independence in 1783, settlers started trickling into Dakota territory. By the early 1800s, that trickle became a flood. These weren't traders looking to bargain. They were farmers, families, and speculators hungry for land. The Dakota watched as wagons rolled in, axes felled, trees and fences sprouted where buffalo once roamed. A Wapakut elder might have stood at the edge of his village in 1820 muttering to his son, "These whites don't trade, they take." He wasn't wrong. The newcomers didn't see the Dakota as partners or kin. To them the Dakota were obstacles, standing in the way of progress. By the 1830s and 1840s, towns like St. Paul sprang up, and the Dakota found their hunting grounds shrinking. The buffalo herds thinned, pushed west by settles' plows. The fish camps grew quieter, as rivers clogged with silt from cleared land. This shift didn't happen overnight. It was a slow squeeze. The Dakota weren't blind to it. They dealt with whites for generations, But this was different. These settlers didn't want furs or alliances. They wanted everything official counts from the time. Show the white population in Minnesota exploding from a few hundred in 1805 to over 600 by 1850, with thousands more pouring in each year. The Dakota, once masters of their domain, now faced a stark reality. They were no longer welcome on the land. Their ancestors had walked for centuries. Some argued they could adapt further, negotiate, even assimilate. Others saw the writing on the wall. Coexistence was crumbling. What would they do when the land itself turned against them? That question simmered, setting the stage for what came next. That simmering tension didn't stay quiet for long. By the mid-1800s, the Dakota faced a relentless push from the U.S. government and settlers. It started with treaties, documents signed under pressure, often with a mix of promises, bribes, and thinly veiled threats. The first big one came in 1837, when Dakota leaders ceded land east of the Mississippi for cash and goods. Then in 1851, two more treaties, Traverse des Sioux and Mendota, stripped away millions of acres, over 24 million to be exact, leaving the Dakota with a narrow strip along the Minnesota River. Each agreement shrank their world further, a calculated erosion of their territory. By 1858, that strip was all they had left. A 10-mile wide, 150-mile long stretch of land, hemmed in by settlers on all sides. They weren't just losing space, they were losing their ability to live as they always had. The treaties promised annual payments, money and supplies to offset the land loss. But when those payments arrived, they rarely reached Dakota hands. Traders backed by government agents swooped in, claiming debts for goods sold on credit. A federal report from 1857 showed that, of the $140,000 sold to the Dakota that year, traders pocketed over 70%, leaving families with scraps. "They owe us for flour and blankets," a trader might have argued, tallying up inflated bills, while Dakota children went hungry nearby. The system wasn't broken, it was built this way, funneling wealth away from the people. It was meant to help. Some Dakota leaders protested, but their voices drowned in a bureaucracy that didn't care. It was now 1861. The corn crop failed, withered by drought and pests. Families who'd once hunted freely now relied on those treaty payments to buy food. But that year the money didn't come. Congress delayed it, tangled in debates over the escalating Civil War. By summer 1862, the Dakota were starving, literally starving, on land that could no longer sustain them. Historical records estimate hundreds died of malnutrition before the conflict even began. Desperate, they turned to the traders for help. One Dakota man, his ribs showing through his shirt, approached Andrew Myrick, a well-known merchant at the Lower Sioux Agency. "In August 1862, we have no food," he said, voice steady despite his hunger. Myrick's response was cold. "Well, if they're hungry, let them eat grass or their own dung." The words hit like a slap, arrogant, dismissive. A stark reveal of how little the Dakota mattered. To those in power, Myrick's taunt wasn't just cruel. It was a spark. The Dakota had endured decades of shrinking land and broken promises, but this was different. Starvation wasn't an accident. It was a consequence of policies that treated them as disposable. Historians debate whether the traders' greed or the government's neglect bore more blame. But the result was the same, a people pushed to the edge. Some Dakota argued for patience, hoping the payments would arrive. Others saw no choice but action. Myrick's words, recorded by witnesses and later recounted in settler accounts, showed the contempt they faced, a contempt that begged the question: how much more could they take before fighting back? The answer wouldn't wait long. By August 1862, the Dakota had reached their breaking point. No more pleading at the government warehouses. No more watching their children starve while traders hoarded supplies. On August 17th, it began for young Dakota men hunting near Acton Township. Clashed with settlers, a petty argument turned deadly, leaving 5 whites dead. Word spread fast, and the next day Dakota leaders met in council. Some urged restraint, but others, like Chief Little Crow, saw no other path. "We are dying here," he said, his voice low but firm, "and they laugh at us. If we must die, let it be fighting." The decision was made: they would take back their land. War parties fanned out across the Minnesota River Valley. Over the next 5 weeks they struck settlements, trading posts and farms. Historical records tally over 500 white deaths, men, women, even children caught in the sudden fierce attacks. At New Ulm, settlers barricaded the town, but Dakota warriors burned buildings and drove them back. The violence was brutal, chaotic and swift. No one counted the Dakota dead. Warriors fell in skirmishes, their bodies left where they dropped, unrecorded by a government that saw them only as rebels. Estimates suggest dozens, perhaps hundreds, perished. But the exact toll remains a gap in the archives, a silent testament to the war's uneven reckoning. By September, the U.S. Army moved in. Colonel Henry Sibley led 14 troops, bolstered by militia, against the Dakota forces. On September 23rd, at the Battle of Wood Lake, the tide turned. Dakota fighters, outnumbered and outgunned, lost decisively, 27 killed in that clash alone. According to Sibley's reports, the war ended as quickly as it had begun. Most Dakota scattered, fleeing west or north. Their village is abandoned. It marked the last time they'd lived together as a unified nation, their cohesion shattered by defeat and dispersal. The aftermath was merciless. Soldiers rounded up 17 Dakota, mostly women, children, and elders, and marched them to a prison camp below Fort Snelling, near St. Paul, crammed into a fenced enclosure. Along the Mississippi River, they faced a brutal winter. Disease tore through the camp. Smallpox and measles claimed lives daily. Records from the fort note at least 130 deaths by spring 1863. Though survivors later said the number was higher, closer to 300, buried in unmarked graves along the riverbank. Meanwhile, Minnesota's politicians fueled public outrage. Governor Alexander Ramsey stood before the state legislature in September 1862 and declared, "The Sioux Indians must be exterminated or driven forever beyond our borders." Newspapers fanned the flames, printing lurid tales of savage massacres. To justify revenge, military trials followed. A rushed affair overseen by Sibley's commission. Between September and November, they tried 393 Dakota men, often in groups with sessions lasting mere minutes. No lawyers, no translators, just accusations and quick verdicts. Over 300 were sentenced to hang, charged with murder or attacks on settlers. The list reached President Abraham Lincoln, who reviewed it amid the Civil War's chaos. Facing pressure from Minnesota to execute them all, he pored over the trial records. In December 1862, Lincoln cut the number to 38, approving only those linked directly to civilian deaths. A compromise that satisfied no one. Critics argued he caved to political demands. Defenders said he showed restraint in a vengeful climate. On December 26, 1862, the day after Christmas, Mankato became a grim stage. A massive gallows built to hang all 38 at once loomed over the town square. Thousands of settlers gathered, a restless crowd buzzing with anticipation. The Dakota men, hands bound, climbed the scaffold. Drummers beat a steady rhythm as they sang death songs in their language, voices rising above the murmurs below. Then at 10 a.m., a single rope was cut and the platform dropped. The largest mass execution in U.S. history was over. In moments, witnesses later recalled the eerie silence that followed, broken only by the creak of ropes. For the Dakota, it wasn't just a loss of lives, it was a fracture in their world. What would become of those left behind? The executions didn't end the Dakota's ordeal. It was just the beginning of a new chapter of suffering. After enduring that brutal winter, in the Fort Snelling camp, the survivors roughly 1,300 by spring 1863 faced exile. In May, U.S. troops herded them onto steamboats. Docked along the Mississippi, families shuffled aboard, clutching what little they had left, a few blankets, some worn-out clothes, their children clinging to their sides. The boats turned westbound for Dakota Territory. Hundreds of miles from the Minnesota River Valley, they'd called home. Conditions below deck were suffocating, crowded airless spaces reeking of sweat and sickness. A missionary on board, Stephen Riggs, scribbled in his journal, "It's like the middle passage of the slave ships, humanity packed in, dying by the hour." The boat stopped every few days, not for rest but to dig shallow graves along the banks. Records don't pin down an exact count, but survivors later spoke of dozens lost to cholera and exhaustion before they even reached their destination. They arrived at Crow Creek in June 1863, a patch of land in what's now South Dakota. It was a stark contrast to the fertile Minnesota valleys, dry, wind-swept, and stubborn with soil that refused to yield much. Beyond sparse grass, the government promised rations, but supplies trickled in late or not at all. A military report from late 1863 noted barrels of flour arriving, spoiled, and salt pork so rancid it was barely edible. The Dakota tried to hunt, but game was scarce. Buffalo herds had long since moved west. Beyond their reach, that first winter hit hard. Snow piled up, winds howled, and hunger gnawed at the camp. By spring, 186 for 300 people. Nearly a quarter of the group were dead, mostly children and elders, their bodies buried in unmarked pits. A Dakota woman, her voice trembling as she spoke to a missionary, said, "We feed the ground here with our bones. What's left for the living?" Crow Creek wasn't a home, it was a punishment. The land couldn't sustain them, and the government's neglect made survival a daily gamble. Some historians argue the site was chosen deliberately, a barren exile meant to break the Dakota spirit after their uprising. Others point to logistics. Washington was too busy with the Civil War to care where they went, as long as it was far from Minnesota. Either way, the result was the same: a slow bleed of life. By 1866, after 3 years of misery, the camp was abandoned. The Dakota who survived, down to about 1,000, were shifted again, this time to a new reservation at Santee in Nebraska. Crow Creek stood empty, a silent marker of a policy that valued removal over humanity. For those who endured, the question lingered: could they rebuild from such a wasteland? The collapse of Crow Creek didn't mean the end. For the Dakota, it marked a scattering, a forced reshaping of their lives. By 1866, the survivors, about 1,000 of them, shifted downstream to a new reservation in Nebraska. Called Santee, the land wasn't lush, but it offered a fresh start. Along the Missouri River's banks, they built homes from timber and sod, planted corn, and tried to stitch their community back together. Around the same time, another group rejoined them. The last Dakota men, released from a military prison in Davenport, Iowa. Over 160 had been held there since 1863, convicted in the same rush trials that sent 38 to the gallows, freed in April 1866. They arrived thin and weary but determined. One man, his hands still calloused from breaking rocks, turned to his brother as they stepped onto Santee soil and said, "We're not ghosts yet. We'll make something here." Together, they raised cabins and rekindled old kinship ties, laying the foundation for a fragile but stubborn revival. Not all Dakota stayed put. Thousands had fled Minnesota after the 1862 war, heading west into Dakota Territory, vast plains stretching across what's now North and South Dakota. They traveled in small bands, hoping distance would shield them. It didn't. The U.S. Army pursued, ordered to root out any hostiles. Between 1863 and 1864, General Alfred Sully led campaigns that torched camps and scattered families. Official reports claim over 300 Dakota killed in these raids, though the true number likely climbed higher. Lost in the chaos of unlogged skirmishes, some found temporary refuge among relatives near Devil's Lake, a marshy expanse settlers named for its eerie isolation. There, Dakota women wove mats from reeds while men hunted, whispering plans to stay one step ahead of the soldiers. Others looked north. Hundreds crossed into Canada, drawn by rumors of safety under British rule. By late 1862, they reached what's now Manitoba and Saskatchewan, ragged and exhausted after weeks on foot. British officials, wary of U.S. demands for their return, labeled them refugees and offered minimal aid, small plots of land far from white settlements. A Dakota elder addressing a British agent in 1863 said simply, "We ran from death. Don't send us back today." Their descendants live on tiny reserves dotting Canada's northwest, places like Birdtail Sioux and Whitecap, Dakota, home to fewer than 2,000 Dakota total, according to 2021 census data. These remote pockets kept them out of the colonial crosshairs that battered their U.S. kin. With fewer settlers pressing in, they held on to their language, Dakota dialects still spoken by elders, and their ceremonies practiced away from prying eyes. This split existence wasn't just survival. It was adaptation under fire. In Nebraska, Sandy became a hub, its population stabilizing at around 12 by 1870. Per government rolls in Dakota Territory, the hunted bands dwindled, some absorbed into other Sioux nations, like the Lakota in Canada. Isolation bred resilience, preserving traditions the U.S. tried to erase. Historians debate whether this dispersal weakened the Dakota or proved their tenacity. Likely both. The army could chase them, starvation could thin them, but they kept moving, kept living. How long could that endurance last against a system bent on breaking them? That endurance faced a new test as the U.S. government shifted tactics. In 1887, Senator Henry Dawes of Massachusetts pushed through the General Allotment Act, a law aimed at dismantling Native communities. Under the guise of progress, the plan was simple: carve up reservations into 160-acre plots, one for each Dakota family. At Santee and other reserves, agents arrived with surveyors, marking lines across land the Dakota had held collectively for generations. They handed out deeds and plows, expecting families to farm like white settlers. "This is yours now, work it right," an agent might have said, dropping a sack of seed at a Dakota doorstep. The catch: any land not allotted. Over 80% of the Santee Reservation open to white homesteaders. By 1890, settlers flooded in, claiming 90,000 acres of former Dakota territory in Nebraska alone, according to federal surveys. The Dawes Act wasn't just about land. It was about erasure across Indian country. It slashed Native holdings from 138 million acres in 1887 to 48 million by 1930 for a loss of over two-thirds. Documented by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. For the Dakota, it meant shrinking from a viable reservation to scattered patches, too small to sustain traditional hunting or communal farming. Some adapted, coaxing crops from tough soil, but many couldn't. The law assumed they'd assimilate, shedding their identity for a plow and a ballot. Critics later called it a land grab dressed as charity. Dawes himself boasted it would civilize them.